And now we move to a discussion of an important historical event, something that too many Americans still have never heard of, the Tulsa Race Massacre, a horrific incident in which white residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma massacred a countless number of African American residents of Tulsa, destroying untold amount of wealth in addition to lives lost. This happened almost exactly 101 years ago. And today we're going to discuss the incident, why so many people don't know about it, what happened on the centennial, the anniversary last year, and what can be done to achieve justice and awareness about this important moment in American history. To discuss this important issue, I'd like to welcome on our special guest, Brother Quraysh Ali Lansana, who is a professor and writer in resident at Oklahoma State University-Tulsa. He is the acting director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. How are you doing today?
I am well today, brethren. How are you?
I'm well, alhamdulillah. Thank you so much for joining us. We greatly appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with us. So let me first ask you a question that is beneath you, but is important because, as I mentioned, so many people still don't know what happened. Can you just give our viewers a little rundown of what the Tulsa Race Massacre was? What happened 101 years ago?
Sure. Mythology surrounding the events that led up to the massacre is that a 19-year-old young man named Dick Rowland, who was a shoeshine boy at the Ingersoll parlor at 3rd and Main, who was, because of Jim Crow segregation, forced to use the bathroom at the Drexel building, also at 3rd and Main, that he got on the elevator, as he often did, with a 17-year-old young white woman who worked the elevator named Sarah Page. And on the way down, after on his way back to work, he allegedly grabbed her. She screamed. A employee from a local clothing store came to her aid. He ran, and thus that was the impetus for a state-sanctioned, city, municipal government-sanctioned mob of white folks creating an invasion. Actually, World War I vets taking the time between the meeting at the courthouse where groups of black men and groups of armed white men interacted around 10:30 p.m. on May 31st. And by 5 a.m. on June 1st, with the whistle blast coming from a brickyard, thousands of white men from both the east and the south, in a very coordinated invasion, staged an assault on 36 to 40 blocks of Black-owned Success, and killing over 300 people and destroying one of the wealthiest, most prosperous communities, Black communities in the country, which had existed from 1906 to 1921. But really what we historians know as truth is that there was a land grab, that the white folks from the South really were interested in acquiring the land in North Tulsa for their own means, initially to create sort of a trucking hub. And so that was their goal. And so there were many folks who believed that, the incident between Sarah Page and Dick Rowland was the catalyst. That was an excuse. The land grab was well known. It's well documented. And one of the most interesting things and tragic things about the massacre, of course, in addition to the loss of life, over 300 folks, in addition to, property, homes, banks, businesses, all Black owned, over 600 to 1,000, businesses, 10,000 Black residents displaced, is that loss of generational wealth that you alluded to in your intro, in your open, that we are here at the 101st observation of the massacre, and Black folks own very little in Tulsa. Only 36% of Black folks own their homes in North Tulsa. The mortality rate, the gap in mortality is 11 years. There were hospitals. There were 2 hospitals in Greenwood, in the Greenwood district prior to the massacre. Now there's not one. There's only been a grocery store in North Tulsa built in the last 3 years. And so that generational wealth, that economic divide, the residuals of the massacre in terms of property, equity, access, are very, very alive and very pungent today, even as we again are 101 years past the event.
Absolutely. And so, Professor, let me ask you the next question, which is, why don't more people know about this, right? This happened 101 years ago, and this is obviously very prominently in the news last year, and it was news to most people, I would dare say, in America when this was covered last year. Why is that?
Well, you're right, Edward. Sadly, most folks learned about the massacre via the Watchmen series, right? And then wondered, did this really happen? And then, did a little bit of fact finding and, of course, learned that it was actually true. What we need to understand, I think what folks need to understand is that the state government of Oklahoma, the municipal government of Tulsa, buried this by design and actually threatened Black folks who survived and stayed in Tulsa actually felt threatened and or ashamed by speaking about it. So many Black folks from generations past just didn't talk about it. It was too traumatic. They had also literally been threatened about speaking about it would cost them their lives, another massacre. And then the state chose to not include this history in Oklahoma history textbooks that is a required course for all 8th and or 9th graders in the state. And so this history was systematically buried and eliminated and removed from being discussed or taught successfully for almost a century. It's only been in the last 3 to 5 years that this history has been included in Oklahoma history curriculum for high school students at all. Right. And so that was by design, right? That was by design. It was the state government, the city government that all said, we're going to bury this. We're going to erase this history. They did not expect the national stain or shame that this incident would bring to Tulsa and to Oklahoma. And for a time, even a lack of support from not the federal government, but from other entities because of the event. So they buried it, they erased it, they eliminated and successfully remove the incident from the memory of most Oklahomans, again, for almost a century.
So let me ask you this, Professor. Is any of this changing now in the wake of the centennial, the wide awareness that was raised about it? Has the educational system changed in how it treats this issue? Government officials there? Has anything changed now in terms of how the people of Oklahoma and the government of Oklahoma is addressing what happened 101 years ago?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I'll answer that by saying yes and no. Certainly within the last, again, as I mentioned, 3 to 5 years, the state the state actually paid for the creation of a curriculum that is, approved and taught in middle schools and some high schools in the state now. I believe that curriculum to be very tepid. I don't believe that curriculum goes far enough really into what I call in my teaching on the Greenwood District, Black excellence over Black pain. Right. I don't think there's enough time in that curriculum spent on the fact that Black folks, one generation removed from chattel slavery, and in the face of the apartheid, commonly known as Jim Crow, built by bartering, by working together, by a sense of community and resilience, one of the most thriving Black communities in the nation from 1906 to 1921, actually in many ways not quite predating Harlem, but the Hill District in Pittsburgh, North Philly, even Bronzeville and Chicago, where I lived for quite some time. And what distinguished Greenwood from probably every of those neighborhoods or communities I mentioned, other than Bronzeville on the south side of of Chicago rather, is that Black folks here owned their land, owned their businesses, own their property and use that equity to help others build, right? And to help others grow and prosper. And again, in the face of the apartheid that's known as Jim Crow, folks had to work together, keep the resources in the community to take care of their essential needs, right? And from that, built a very thriving community, something that we should look back on and study, right? When we think about many of the Black communities that unfortunately exist or that exist in the country today, that unfortunately are still dealing with the systemic racism, with the lack of access and equity and quality education today, right? We should be looking at Greenwood as a case study and how we attempt to rebuild. And again, in Greenwood, right, the Greenwood community rebuilt not once but twice, right? There were over 400 businesses back up in 1922. That's a year before Buck Colbert Franklin, B.C. Franklin, the lead attorney, actually won his cases in the state Supreme Court to remove some of the restrictions that Tulsa put on ordinances and zoning for rebuilding. So more rebuilding could flourish and folks could build on their land again, right? And then again, the really the economic height of the district was 1941, where the economy was double that of 1921. So understanding that resilience, right? That resilience, that entrepreneurial spirit of Black folks in Tulsa has not been taught at all, right? Except for those of us here on the ground and some scholars across the country and around the world who are privy to and understand the import of what happened here. But those two moments, rebuilding a year after, and then into the 30s, into the 50s, right? When this district was vibrant again, before urban renewal, or as James Baldwin put it, Negro removal, right? Before model cities, before this I-244 highway essentially created a division that divided the Black community from downtown and South Tulsa. Black folks showed their resilience, showed their spirit by rebuilding not once but twice, right? And it's something that should be taught more and more widely.
Absolutely. Final question. We're almost out of time, so just a quick answer, inshallah, God willing. What can be done? I mean, this happened 101 years ago. You've touched about the long-standing economic harm that was done. The people who experienced the massacre firsthand, for the most part, are gone. The perpetrators, for the most part, are gone. Yet the damage of this attack still lingers. The consequences still linger. Is there any discussion or prospect of any sort of economic justice, anything to help the descendants of the people impacted by the massacre, to help the Black community of Tulsa, of Oklahoma, to get back to par, so to speak, if they were ever there at all?
Well, yes. I mean, certainly. Currently, there's a lawsuit that is going to make it to trial by lead attorney Demario Solomon Simmons on the Justice for Greenwood movement, and that is to again to get the survivors, and there are only 3 remaining now, right? 108, 107, and 101 years of age, respectively, to get something for the survivors, the 3 remaining survivors and their descendants. This is the furthest that a trial has made it, other than the initial lawsuit in 2001, I believe. So there's some hope there, that something we're waiting to see how this judge rules on which aspect of the lawsuit has been allowed to go through to go to trial. We don't know the answer to that yet, but there's progress there. But there's also, as Sister Nicole Hannah Jones, who I had the privilege of hearing speak last night here in Tulsa, put out there, it's certainly within this nation's purview and history to wait it out, right? There are only 3 remaining survivors left, right? The initial lawsuit was ruled out because of the statute of limitations. Now we have 3 remaining survivors, and again, the oldest is 108, right? And so there's a real, it's not outside of U.S. history for the government to just try and wait it out till these three survivors are ancestors, and then say there's no one here to directly support or survived or benefited from
No, stand
to
it.
benefit from this. Right.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens, bruh. There's some cause for some muted optimism because this case has made it further than any of us expected. Based on the public nuisance ideas or foundations of the opioid crisis lawsuits, right? That's where DeMario sort of came up with this new plan. So we'll see what happens, but
Excellent.
it's muted optimism.
Well, look, we look forward to tracking that and getting updates from you. We hope to have you on again, God willing, to discuss this more. But thank you for sharing this history with us, your expertise, and an update on where things stand now. This is an important part of not just Black history in Tulsa, not just Black history, but American history. It's an ugly, despicable part of our history that cannot be erased or forgotten anymore. So we thank you for keeping the memory of those impacted alive, and thanks for being